Hi, everybody. Dr. Demito here. I wanted to go over this reading for this week, Introduction to Epidemiology, 8th edition. I thought perhaps we could look through it together. It might make more sense, be a little more understandable. So let's look at chapter 1 and we look at the foundations of epidemiology. I love epidemiology. I think that it's a fascinating field. I enjoyed doing it in my doctorate. That's probably what I like the most about it. But here are the objectives of this chapter. Define epidemiology, identify selected activities performed in epidemiology, explain the role of epidemiology in public health, define epidemic, endemic, and pandemic, describe common source, propagated, and mixed epidemics, and describe why a standard case definition and adequate levels of reporting are important in epidemiologic investigations, describe disease transmission concepts, describe the epidemiology triangle for infectious disease, describe selected models for chronic disease and behavioral disorders, and define the 3 levels of prevention used in public health and epidemiology. Understand the basic vocabulary used in epidemiology. So those are objectives for this chapter. What is health? The World Health Organization has this definition of health. It is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So someone can have health and still have a chronic disease. It encompasses those other factors. And public health. We talked about this a lot last week. So, public health, it's defined as the science and art of promoting health on the population level. Public health is concerned with threats to the health of the population, and the mission of public health is to ensure conditions that promote the 6 dimensions of health in the population as a whole. What are the 6 dimensions of health? We have them listed here: physical, social, mental, emotional, spiritual, and environmental. So all of those components are essential for health. How does public health relate to epidemiology? The two work very closely together. There are many subfields of public health, including epidemiology, biostatistics, and health services. And the central role of public health, epidemiology, is commonly referred as the foundation of public health. So epidemiology was, paramount. I always go back to COVID. It was of paramount importance where public health and population health was concerned, anytime during an endemic, pandemic, or concerns. Like right now, there is an issue going on in New York with Legionella. They're finding that people are getting Legionnaire's disease from faulty air conditioning units in their apartment buildings. It's not the individual air conditioning units, it's the cooling towers in the central air conditioning. And it was the steps of public health and epidemiology that went in and did that investigation and found out where this was coming from. Otherwise, it could have gotten much worse. I think that it's bad enough. I think 17 people have died. The problem with Legionella is a type of pneumonia which is treated quite easily if it's caught early. But many people are not getting it caught early because it's so uncommon. They're going in, they're told they've got the flu, and then they go home, and then it's too late. So, what's epidemiology? It's the study of the distribution and determinants of health related states or events in human populations and the application of this study to prevent and control health problems. I really, really enjoy epidemiology. So, key terms in the definition: health related states or events. So, disease states include things like cholera, influenza, pneumonia, mental illness, conditions associated with health, physical activity, nutrition, environmental poisonings, seatbelt use, and provision and use of health services. Events like injury, drug abuse, and suicide. We know that in this country, the rate of drug overdose due to fentanyl has skyrocketed in recent years. So we're working very, very diligently to try to bring those numbers down by reducing the ability of the drug to come into our country. So, epidemiology is the foundation of public health. Why is that? It's because its central role contains these three core functions: the assessment and monitoring of the health of communities and populations at risk, the formulation of public policies designed to identify local and national health problems to assure that all populations have access to appropriate and cost-effective care, including health promotion and disease prevention services, and the evaluation of effectiveness of that care. So they do their best to try to move forward these three core public health initiatives. So it uses the scientific method to describe and analyze health-related states and events, and the scientific method involves using appropriate study designs and statistical techniques for investigating an observable occurrence and acquiring new knowledge. So first we have to define the health problem, formulate a hypothesis, perform statistical testing, interpret that data, and disseminate what we've learned. So that's the scientific method. You'll learn so much more about this as you further your education. If you are moving on to a doctorate degree, this is the basis of what you're going to be doing as you achieve that degree. Study designs in epidemiology are going to be studied a little bit later. But right now, descriptive epidemiology involves study designs used to answer the who, what, when, and where. Analytic epidemiology is a means of identifying and quantifying associations, testing hypotheses, and supporting statements about causality. It involves study designs used to answer that why and that how. And you can see this little, it's not a graph, but this little graphic over here, descriptive and analytic epidemiology. The difference is descriptive is when the population was affected, where the population was affected, who was affected, and then analytic is how was the population affected and why was the population affected. So some of the activities performed in epidemiology, we want to identify risk factors for disease, injury, and death, describe the natural history of disease, and identify individuals and populations at the greatest risk. We want to identify where the public health problem is the greatest and monitor diseases and other health-related events over time. And as I stated in last week's materials, this is not a one-size-fits-all type of a process, because the events that are occurring in Illinois may not be occurring in Tennessee or in Washington State or Mississippi. So you need to consider those specific populations and what the needs are. Continued selective activities performed in epidemiology is evaluating the efficacy and effectiveness of prevention and treatment programs, provide information useful in health planning and decision making for establishing health programs with appropriate priorities, assisting in carrying out those public health programs, being a resource person and communicating public health information. So that's a really big job. And it's like that circle. It's like the nursing process. It's constantly being evaluated because a process that you put in place may be effective initially. It may be wonderful. But over time, it may not be as effective, and you may actually have to go back and change that process. So here's some definitions. I'm not going to read all of them, but an epidemic, endemic, pandemic, outbreak, and cluster. So, for example, right now, the cases of Legionella in New York, that's a cluster because it's in a given area. More cases are going on there than expected. Um, epidemic, it's above the expected period over time. Pandemic is the big one. This is COVID. COVID was a pandemic. It affects a large number of people in many countries, continents, or regions. Now, disease transmission. It usually occurs by one of the following ways: person to person, okay? Fomite-borne objects like hepatitis can be spread by a contaminated eating utensil, doorknob, or vehicle-borne, inanimate, immediate, or intermediate like HIV/AIDS can be spread through needle sharing, contaminated food, water, soil. Vector-borne in invertebrate animal like mosquitoes. Note that a reservoir may also be involved. And a reservoir is the habitat, living or non-living, on which an infectious agent lives, grows, multiplies, and is dependent for its survival in nature. And humans often serve as both reservoir and host. So these disease conditions can live and grow and thrive in our bodies. And we have the ability to spread this disease to others, be it blood, sex, or actually through transmission through touch in some cases, and secretions. So common source propagated in mixed epidemics. We have a common source, propagated, and mixed. And the definitions for these are as will be discussed as we move forward. A common source or point epidemics, they tend to result in more cases happening faster. Identifying and removing exposure to the common source can cause that epidemic to rapidly decrease. So we've got an example: anthrax, botulism, and cholera. Those are examples of point epidemics. Propagated epidemics. These arise from infections being transmitted from one person to another. They can be transmitted through direct or indirect routes, and host-to-host epidemics rise and fall more slowly than common source epidemics. So this can be tuberculosis, whooping cough, influenza, measles. Mixed occurs when a common source epidemic is followed by person-to-person contact and the disease is spread as a propagated outbreak. So let's talk about this example. Shigellosis occurred among a group of 3,000 women attending a music festival. Over the next few weeks, subsequent generations of Shigella cases spread by person-to-person transmission from festival attendees. So this really spread. Now let's look at some accurate assessment. It requires a standard case definition. So a standard set of criteria or a case definition assures that cases are consistently diagnosed regardless of where or when they were identified and who diagnosed the case. So a case is a person who has been diagnosed as having a disease, disorder, injury, or condition. So that's the case. The first disease case in the population is the primary case. The first disease case brought to the attention of the epidemiologist is the index case, but the index case is not always the primary case. A secondary case, those persons who become infected and ill after a disease has been introduced into a population and who have become infected from contact with the primary case. So the very first person who brought COVID to this country is the primary case. Everybody who caught COVID from him are secondary cases. And here we have some information from the CDC on measles. There is a resurgence in some areas of measles outbreaks. So this is interesting to read about. Different levels of diagnosis. A suspect is when the individual has all the signs but isn't diagnosed, confirmed, all the criteria is met. Here is an example of the epidemiology triangle. This model is used to explain the etiology of infectious diseases. You can recognize the three major factors in a pathogenesis of disease, including the agent, host, and environment over time. The model to the right here introduces the use of a triangle with a social condition like drug abuse. And here's an example of an epidemiology triangle for infectious disease. The triangle is based on the communicable disease model, and it shows the interaction and interdependence of agent, host, environment, and time as used in the investigation of diseases and epidemics. So we have the agent, which is the cause of the disease. Host is an organism, usually a human or an animal, that harbors the disease. Environment includes those surrounding and conditions external to the human or animal that cause or allow the disease transmission, and time, which accounts for incubation periods, life expectancy of the host or the pathogen, and duration or course of the illness or condition. How to stop an epidemic. So it can be stopped when one of the elements of the triangle is interfered with, altered, changed, or removed from existence, so that the disease no longer continues along its mode of transmission and routes of infection. And we tried this with COVID to limit contact with people. So we put people in isolation. We told people not to shake hands, have minimal contact, wash your hands, wear masks. The only problem with that is that I believe that people became too confident in mask wearing, because the average mask is not able to contain viral matter. Viruses are smaller than the pores of the material of a mask. An N95 is the only mask that's adequate, and it's called an N95 because it prevents 95% of all virus and bacteria from entering into the mask or through to the person. Here's an advanced epidemiology triangle for chronic disease and behavioral disorders. A little different, a little more advanced here. And here we have some disease transmission concepts. Fomites are objects like clothing, towels, and utensils that can harbor a disease. An example of this is transmission of cutaneous anthrax from drums to an individual. A vector is that invertebrate animal like a tick, mite, mosquito. It can spread an infectious agent from an infected animal or human to other susceptible animals or humans. And here's an example of transmission by multiple routes. Plague. So Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes plague, is found in animals throughout many parts of the world. Most commonly in rats, but sometimes in wild animals like prairie dogs. And it's transmitted three different ways. Bites from an infected rodent flea, direct contact with infected tissue or body fluids, or inhaling infected droplets. Now let's talk about a reservoir and a carrier. In a reservoir, the habitat on which an infectious agent lives, grows, multiplies, and is dependent on for its survival nature. Humans often serve as both reservoir and host. A vector is an organism that transmits an organism from a reservoir to a host. A carrier contains, spreads, or harbors an infectious organism. For example, typhoid Mary was the carrier, typhoid Mary. The carrier is a louse, flea, tick, or mite. Zoonosis. This is when an animal transmits a disease to a human, like rabies, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, shigellosis. And 3 levels of prevention in public health and epidemiology. Number 1, primary. And we should know all of these from our undergrad nursing of an example of what primary prevention is. Immunization, sanitation, education, media campaign, and warning labels. Here's some examples of active and passive primary prevention, rather. Secondary prevention focuses on reducing the progress of the disease. We know the disease exists in the person, so we do cancer screening. Note that cancer is already present, but the goal is to detect the cancer before clinical symptoms arise in order to improve the prognosis. Another example is diabetes screening. Tertiary prevention focuses on reducing the limitation of disability from disease. So the disease has already occurred. So, for example, physical therapy for strokes, halfway houses for alcoholics, shelter homes for the developmentally disabled, fitness programs for heart attack patients. And here's a big graph that looks at the natural history of disease and the level of prevention. So take a look at this, and I don't expect you to memorize any of these things. I think essentially what this slide does is condense everything that we've discussed and puts it into one slide. So I hope that you found this presentation beneficial. It's an introduction into epidemiology to tell you what it's all about and to define some of the language. You need to know what kind of language is used, the terminology used in this in epidemiology, in order to have a greater understanding of what the content is all about. So some of the concepts of this presentation will be in your quiz this week, so it would be a good idea to have a basic understanding of the terminology related to epidemiology. So thank you so much. Have a great day.